I was 74 years old when I joined my first Facebook group about retiring in the Philippines. If you'd told me a year earlier that I'd spend my evenings reading conversations between strangers on the other side of the world, I would have laughed. After my husband passed away, life became very quiet. Not lonely all the time, just quiet. Our children called whenever they could. My daughter lived in Colorado. My son was in Texas. They loved me. I never questioned that. But they had families of their own, careers, responsibilities. Their lives kept moving forward. Mine felt like it had quietly stopped. Every morning started exactly the same. I'd make a cup of coffee, open the kitchen blinds, watch the neighborhood wake up. Then I'd ask myself the same question. What should I do today? Most days, I didn't have an answer. One evening, I stumbled across a YouTube video about someone who had retired overseas. I don't even remember what I searched for. Maybe I was looking for travel videos. Maybe I was just trying to fill another quiet evening. Either way, the algorithm kept showing me more. The Philippines, again and again. Eventually, I became curious enough to join a Facebook group for retirees living there. At first, I never posted anything. I just read. Hundreds of conversations, questions about visas, apartments, doctors, groceries, power outages, rainy season. Things only people who actually lived there seemed to understand. It felt less like social media and more like sitting quietly in the corner of a room, listening. One night, someone asked a simple question. If you could retire anywhere in the Philippines today, where would you go? I expected everyone to answer Manila or Cebu. Instead, one city kept appearing over and over, Cagayan de Oro. I had never heard of it, not once. So I opened Google. The first thing I noticed was that it wasn't a tiny beach town. It was a real city. Modern shopping centers, tree-lined streets, coffee shops, hospitals, restaurants. Then I kept reading. Someone wrote, if you're looking for a quieter life, take a look at uptown Cagayan de Oro. Another person replied, that's where a lot of retirees end up. Someone else added, it's modern without feeling overwhelming. I must have spent 2 hours reading those comments. That night, before I went to bed, I wrote 4 words on a yellow notepad beside my chair. Cagayan de Oro. I still had absolutely no idea how to pronounce it, but for the first time in years, I found myself wondering what tomorrow might look like. Over the next few weeks, that Facebook group slowly became part of my daily routine. Every morning after breakfast, I'd make another cup of coffee, sit in my favorite chair, and read. Some people posted photos of fresh fruit from the local market. Others complained about paperwork. One gentleman wrote 3 paragraphs explaining why it was impossible to find decent cheddar cheese. That one made me laugh. It all felt ordinary, not like vacation pictures, just people living their lives. One afternoon, I finally worked up the courage to ask my own question. It took me nearly 20 minutes to type, then delete, then type again. Finally, I pressed post. I wrote, I'm 74 years old. I've never traveled by myself. Is the Philippines really a place someone my age could move to alone? For a few minutes, nothing happened. I remember wondering if I'd made a mistake. Then the notifications started. 1 reply became 5. 5 became 20. By the end of the evening, more than 60 people had answered. Some told me to stay where I was. A few thought I was too old. Others warned me about moving halfway around the world. They weren't trying to be cruel. They were trying to protect me. I appreciated that. But then I started reading the replies from people who had actually done it. One woman said, "I moved here at 70. Another man wrote, "I thought I'd be lonely. Instead, I met more friends in 2 years than I had in the previous 10. I read every single comment, twice. Late that evening, one reply caught my attention. It wasn't the longest. It wasn't the funniest. It was only 2 sentences. I came for the lower cost of living. I stayed because I stopped feeling lonely. I must have read those words 20 times, maybe more. Not because I was worried about money. My retirement was modest, but comfortable. It was the second sentence. I stayed because I stopped feeling lonely. I kept asking myself, what would that even feel like? The next morning, instead of making coffee first, I opened Google Maps. I searched Cagayan de Oro, then Uptown Cagayan de Oro. I spent nearly an hour moving little yellow street view down unfamiliar roads. Coffee shops, restaurants, a modern shopping mall, wide sidewalks, people walking, students carrying backpacks, families eating together. It wasn't what I'd imagined. If someone had shown me those pictures without telling me where they were, I don't think I would have guessed the Philippines. That afternoon, I called my daughter. I tried to sound casual. I've been reading about a city called Cagayan de Oro. There was a long pause. Then she laughed. "Mom, where is that?" I smiled. "I was hoping you knew." We both laughed. Neither of us had ever heard of it before. Later that night, after our phone call, I sat back down in my chair. The yellow notepad was still beside me. Under the words Cagayan de Oro, I wrote something else. Maybe. Just one word. Maybe. Looking back, that tiny word carried more hope than I realized at the time. For almost 2 months, I never booked anything. No airline tickets, no hotels, nothing. I simply kept reading. Every evening, I'd learn something new. How visas worked, what groceries cost, which neighborhoods retirees seemed to like. The more I learned, the less impossible the idea felt. But one word kept appearing, Mindanao. I'd never paid much attention to geography. I knew the Philippines was made up of islands, but that was about it. So one afternoon, I searched Cagayan de Oro, then Mindanao. The first page wasn't exactly comforting. News articles, travel advisories, old headlines, stories that made me wonder if I was completely out of my mind. I closed my laptop, made another cup of coffee, and decided maybe everyone else had been right. Maybe I was too old for this. The next morning, I opened the Facebook group again. This time, I didn't search for apartments. I searched one word, safety. There were hundreds of conversations. Some people refused to visit Mindanao. Others had lived there for years. The opinions couldn't have been more different. That only made the decision harder. Finally, I wrote another post. I've been reading about Cagayan de Oro. Can I ask an honest question? Would you let your own mother move there? I wasn't looking for statistics. I just wanted honest answers. The replies surprised me. One gentleman wrote, "My mother lives here. She walks every morning." Another said, "My wife and I have been here for 8 years. We're happier than we ever expected." One woman replied, "No place is perfect. The important thing is learning where you'll feel comfortable." That sentence stayed with me. No place is perfect. I wasn't looking for perfect. I was looking for somewhere that finally felt like life could begin again. Around that same time, people in the group kept mentioning one area, uptown Cagayan de Oro. Some described it as quieter. Others liked how modern it felt. Several retirees said almost everything they needed was close by. Coffee shops, grocery stores, restaurants, hospitals. One person joked, "You can spend half the day in uptown and forget you're in a city." I smiled. That sounded exactly like something I'd enjoy. A few nights later, my daughter called. She could tell something was on my mind. "Mama, what are you thinking about?" I looked over at the yellow notepad, then quietly answered, "I think I might actually do this." There was silence. Not angry silence, worried silence. Finally, she asked, "The Philippines?" "Yes." Another pause. "Where?" I took a deep breath. "Cagayan de Oro." Neither of us said anything for a few seconds. Then she quietly asked, "Are you sure?" I wanted to tell her yes. I wanted to sound confident. Instead, I smiled to myself. "No, I'm not. But I think if I don't try, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I had." Neither of us spoke for a while. Sometimes love sounds exactly like silence. 3 days after talking with my daughter, I drove to the library. Not because I needed a book. I needed better internet. My laptop was getting old, and for some reason, buying an international airline ticket felt too important to do over my slow connection at home. I found a quiet table near the back, opened my laptop, took a deep breath, and searched flights to Cagayan de Oro. There wasn't a direct flight. Of course there wasn't. One connection became two. The trip looked impossibly long, almost 24 hours. I stared at the screen for several minutes. Part of me hoped something would go wrong. Maybe the website would crash. Maybe the prices would be ridiculous. Maybe I'd have an excuse to close my laptop and drive home. None of those things happened. Instead, I found a ticket I could afford, a round-trip ticket, 3 months apart. I remember smiling when I saw that. It made the whole thing feel less permanent. I wasn't moving, not yet. I was simply giving myself permission to see another part of the world. If I hated it, I'd come home. That promise made clicking the next button a little easier. When the payment finally went through, I just sat there. The confirmation email appeared. There it was, my name, my flights, my passport information. It suddenly became real. I wasn't reading Facebook anymore. I wasn't watching YouTube. I wasn't imagining another life. I had just bought a ticket to the Philippines. I actually laughed, not because I was excited, because I couldn't believe I'd done it. A 74-year-old retired librarian who had never traveled alone had just booked a trip to the other side of the world. If someone had walked past my table right then, they probably would have wondered why an older woman was sitting alone, laughing at her computer. The drive home felt different. The same roads, the same stoplights, the same grocery store I'd passed hundreds of times. Nothing around me had changed, yet somehow everything had. For the first time in years, the future wasn't blank anymore. It had a departure date. The weeks before the trip disappeared faster than I expected. I made lists, then lists for my lists. Passport, insurance, medication, copies of important documents, power adapters, walking shoes. Every evening, I'd cross another item off, then think of 2 more. The Facebook group became even more helpful. I asked what kind of clothes I should bring. Someone reminded me not to overpack. Another retiree told me, "You'll buy half the things you need after you arrive." One woman who lived in Uptown wrote, If you're staying near SM Uptown, there's almost everything you'll need within a few minutes. That made me smile. It sounded comfortable. The yellow notepad beside my chair was beginning to fill up. Packing list, phone numbers, flight times, simple reminders. Then one evening, without really thinking about it, I wrote something at the bottom of the page. I hope I belong. I stared at those 4 words for a long time, because that was the truth. It had never really been about moving. It had never even been about the Philippines. I simply wanted to know if there was still a place in the world waiting for me. I don't remember much about the first flight, or the second, or even the airport where I changed planes. Somewhere along the way, everything blurred together. Airports have a strange way of doing that. You walk for miles, yet somehow never feel like you've gone anywhere. Most of the passengers were asleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind found another reason to worry. Had I packed enough medication? Would my phone work? Would immigration ask questions I couldn't answer? Would I understand anyone? Would I get hopelessly lost before I even reached my hotel? The questions just kept coming. At one point, I looked out the window. Nothing but darkness below. Somewhere, far beneath the airplane, was the Pacific Ocean. It suddenly occurred to me I had never been this far from home, not even close. There was something strangely comforting about that thought. It reminded me there was no turning back now, only forward. A few hours later, the captain's voice came over the speaker. "We'll begin our descent shortly." People around me started opening the window shades, stretching, collecting their bags. I could feel my heart beating faster. This was it. The first thing I noticed wasn't the airport. It was the color. Everything outside looked so incredibly green. Palm trees, rolling hills in the distance. Even the air looked different somehow. Warmer, softer. I smiled without realizing it. Then I remembered I still had to get through immigration. I'd worried about immigration for weeks. What if I forgot something? What if I stood in the wrong line? What if they asked questions I couldn't answer? Instead, the officer smiled, asked how long I planned to stay, stamped my passport, welcomed me to the Philippines. The entire conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. I almost laughed at myself. I'd spent weeks worrying about something that was over before I knew it. Outside the airport, the warmth wrapped around me almost immediately. Not uncomfortable, just different. The air smelled like rain, even though the sun was shining. Motorcycles buzzed past. People laughed. Someone nearby was loading boxes into the back of a pickup truck while humming to himself. Life was happening all around me, and somehow I was part of it. The drive toward uptown Cagayan de Oro took longer than I expected, mostly because I couldn't stop looking out the window. Every few minutes I'd notice something new. A roadside fruit stand, a small neighborhood bakery, students in uniforms walking home together, a family riding on one motorcycle, tiny stores with handwritten signs. None of it looked like the picture I'd built in my imagination. It looked more normal. As we climbed higher toward uptown, the city began to change. The roads became wider. I noticed newer buildings, coffee shops, modern restaurants, shopping centers, young families walking together, people sitting outside talking over coffee. I remember quietly thinking, so this is uptown. Not because it felt luxurious, because it felt comfortable, manageable, like somewhere I could actually imagine living. When the driver pulled up outside my hotel, I didn't get out right away. I just sat there, looking through the windshield. 23 hours earlier, I'd been sitting in my living room, wondering if I was making the biggest mistake of my life. Now, I was in a city I'd never heard of a few months earlier, 8,000 miles from home. My suitcase sat beside me. The yellow notepad was tucked safely inside my backpack. I took one deep breath, smiled nervously, opened the door, and stepped into the next chapter of my life. The hotel room was exactly what I'd booked online. Small, clean, a comfortable bed, a little desk by the window, an air conditioner humming quietly in the corner. Nothing about it was disappointing. Nothing about it was exciting either. It was simply a room. The driver carried my suitcase inside. I thanked him. He smiled, wished me a pleasant stay, then the door closed behind him. The room became completely still. For the first time since leaving home, there wasn't another passenger, another airport employee, another hotel worker. No voices, no movement, just me. I walked over to the window, pulled the curtain aside. Below me, people were living ordinary Tuesday afternoon lives. A couple crossed the street carrying grocery bags. 2 teenagers laughed as they shared an umbrella. A delivery rider pulled into a parking lot. Cars came and went. Life continued, whether I was there or not. I suddenly felt very far from home. Not homesick, not yet, just aware. Aware that everyone I'd ever known was asleep on the other side of the world. My daughter, my son, my neighbors, even my mailbox. Everything familiar suddenly felt impossibly distant. I sat on the edge of the bed, looked around the room. Then I quietly asked myself, "What exactly have you done?" It wasn't panic. It wasn't regret. It was something in between. The kind of question people ask themselves after making the biggest decision of their lives. I reached into my backpack, pulled out the yellow notepad, the same one that had been sitting beside my chair back home. The pages were now filled with packing lists, flight numbers, hotel information, little reminders I'd written before leaving. I turned to a blank page, held my pen above it. For almost a minute, I couldn't think of anything to write. Finally, I wrote one sentence. I'm here. Nothing more. Just, I'm here. I smiled, folded the notebook closed, and for reasons I still can't explain, that tiny sentence made everything feel a little more real. Around dinner time, I realized I wasn't hungry. Not because of the food, because nerves have a funny way of replacing your appetite. Still, I knew sitting in that room all evening wasn't going to help. So I washed my face, changed my shirt, picked up my room key, and walked downstairs. I didn't have a plan. I wasn't looking for anything special. I simply started walking. The air was warm. The sidewalks were busy without feeling crowded. I passed a small bakery, a pharmacy, families eating together outside restaurants, teenagers taking selfies, office workers finishing their day. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they were going. Everyone except me. After about 15 minutes, I found a small coffee shop. It wasn't part of a big chain, just a quiet little cafe tucked between 2 storefronts. Inside, there were only a handful of customers. I almost kept walking. Then I remembered something I'd promised myself before leaving home. Say yes, even when it feels uncomfortable, especially then. I opened the door. A little bell rang above my head. The young woman behind the counter looked up, smiled, and said, "Good evening, ma'am." It was such a small moment. She greeted hundreds of customers every week, but I never did, because after traveling halfway around the world, those 3 simple words made me feel welcome. I ordered a coffee, found a seat near the window, and watched Uptown slowly settle into the evening. For the first time that day, my shoulders relaxed. Not because I suddenly knew I'd made the right decision. I didn't. But something inside me quietly whispered, "You don't have to figure everything out today." Some days, 1 cup of coffee is enough. The coffee arrived a few minutes later. I wrapped both hands around the cup. Not because it was cold outside, it certainly wasn't. There was just something comforting about holding a warm cup of coffee in a place that still felt unfamiliar. I sat there for a while, watching people come and go. Nobody seemed to be in a hurry. That surprised me. For a city, everything felt remarkably unhurried. A young couple came in with what looked like a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 4 years old. Instead of sitting quietly, she waved at nearly everyone she passed. Most people waved back. Some laughed. One elderly gentleman pretended to salute her. She giggled so loudly, half the coffee shop smiled, including me. I don't know why that moment stayed with me. Maybe because it reminded me of my own granddaughter. Maybe because everyone seemed comfortable talking to complete strangers. Back home, most people politely kept to themselves. Here, the room somehow felt connected. Not noisy, just friendly. A few minutes later, the young woman who had taken my order walked over carrying a glass of water. "I thought you might want this too, ma'am." I thanked her. Then, before I could stop myself, I asked, "Can I ask you something?" She smiled. "Of course." "I just arrived today." Her eyes became a little wider. "Really?" I nodded. "From America." She smiled again. "Welcome to Cagayan de Oro." There was something about the way she said it, not rehearsed, not like customer service, like she genuinely meant it. "I've never been here before," I admitted. I wasn't even sure I'd be able to pronounce the city's name. She laughed, a real laugh, not the polite kind. "You'll get used to it." "I hope so." "You will." She said it so confidently, I almost believed her. She pointed toward the large windows. "If you're staying in Uptown, you're in a nice area to walk." Then she started naming places: coffee shops, the grocery store, a bookstore she liked, a park where families gathered in the evenings. She wasn't trying to sell me anything. She was simply helping. Before returning to the counter, she stopped for a second. "If you need anything while you're here, just ask." Then she smiled again and walked away. That conversation probably lasted 3 minutes, maybe 4. I realized something. For the first time since leaving home, someone had spoken to me without rushing, without looking over my shoulder, without checking their watch. It wasn't a life-changing conversation. It wasn't supposed to be. Sometimes it's the ordinary moments that quietly begin changing your life. When I finished my coffee, I stood up to leave. The young woman smiled from behind the counter. "Have a nice evening." "You too." As I stepped outside, the air had cooled just enough to make walking comfortable. The sun was beginning to disappear behind the hills. Families were still sitting outside restaurants. Students laughed as they walked toward the nearby shopping center. The city somehow felt different now. Not because it had changed, because I had. Just a little. Back in my hotel room, I reached for the yellow notebook. This time, I didn't have to think. I opened to a fresh page and wrote, "Someone welcomed me today." I closed the notebook, turned off the bedside lamp, and for the first time since boarding that airplane, I fell asleep almost immediately. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then I heard a rooster somewhere in the distance, a motorcycle, birds I couldn't identify, and slowly it all came back. I was in Cagayan de Oro. Instead of rushing to make plans, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. Nothing. I sat by the window with a cup of instant coffee from the hotel, watched the clouds drift over the hills, watched people begin another ordinary day. There was something peaceful about not feeling like I had to hurry. For once, there wasn't a schedule waiting for me. Around 8 o'clock, I walked back to the same coffee shop, partly because I liked the coffee, mostly because it was familiar. Funny how quickly a place can begin to feel comfortable. When I stepped inside, the same young woman looked up from the espresso machine. She smiled. "Good morning, ma'am." Then she stopped for a second. "The usual?" I laughed. "I've only been here once." She laughed too. "Then maybe I'm just practicing." That tiny conversation stayed with me all day. Not because she remembered my coffee, she probably didn't. She was simply being kind. Sometimes kindness doesn't have to be accurate. It just has to be sincere. After breakfast, I wandered through Uptown. No destination, no itinerary, just curiosity. I found a grocery store, walked slowly through every aisle. Half the products were unfamiliar, half looked exactly like home. I stood in front of the coffee section for almost 10 minutes, trying to decide if I was brave enough to buy something I'd never tasted before. Eventually, I was. Near the exit, there was a community bulletin board, the kind most people probably walked past without noticing. I almost did. Then one small flyer caught my eye. Community Coffee Morning, every Thursday, 10 a.m. Everyone welcome. Below that, someone had handwritten one simple sentence. No one should have coffee alone. I stood there reading it for a long time. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't professionally printed, just a single sheet of paper pinned to a corkboard. But something about those words stayed with me. No one should have coffee alone. I smiled, folded the corner of the flyer into my yellow notebook, then quietly thought, maybe I'll go. That evening, I opened my yellow notebook again. Today's entry was a little longer. I met someone who understood exactly how I felt. Then underneath, almost without thinking, I added another sentence. I think tomorrow might be a good day. It wasn't a dramatic thought. It didn't need to be. Hope rarely arrives all at once. Sometimes it grows one ordinary day at a time. Thursday morning arrived much faster than I expected. I must have looked at that little flyer 20 times. Community Coffee Morning. Everyone welcome. No one should have coffee alone. It sounded simple enough, yet somehow I found every excuse not to go. Maybe they'd all know each other. Maybe I'd interrupt something. Maybe they didn't really mean everyone. Around 9:30, I was still sitting in my hotel room. The yellow notebook rested on the desk beside me. I stared at it for a long time. Then I remembered something I'd written before leaving home. Say yes, especially when it feels uncomfortable. I smiled to myself. Well, I suppose this counts. The coffee morning was only a short walk away. That somehow made me even more nervous. If I changed my mind, I'd have no excuse. When I reached the building, I stopped outside the entrance. I could hear people talking inside, laughing, cups clinking together. For a moment, I considered turning around. No one knew I was coming. No one would know if I left. Just then, the door opened. A woman about my age stepped outside, carrying 2 empty coffee cups. She smiled when she saw me standing there. "Are you here for coffee?" I hesitated. "I think so." She laughed. "That's the correct answer." Her name was Liza. She'd lived in Cagayan de Oro her entire life. Without asking another question, she held the door open. "Come on. They're friendlier than they look." I laughed. "They look friendly already." Exactly. There were about 15 people inside. Some were retirees, some looked much younger. A few were students. One gentleman was reading the newspaper. Another gentleman was explaining something with his hands while everyone around him laughed. Nobody stopped to stare at me. Nobody made me feel out of place. People simply moved over and made room at the table. The conversation wandered everywhere. Food, travel, grandchildren, gardening, the rainy season. One woman was trying to learn watercolor painting after retiring. Another gentleman had started growing tomatoes on his balcony. Nobody seemed interested in impressing anyone. They were simply enjoying each other's company. I realized I hadn't experienced anything quite like this in years. At one point, someone asked where I was from. When I answered, another lady smiled. "First visit?" "Yes." "What do you think so far?" I looked around the room, then out the nearby window. "I think I've smiled more in the last 2 days than I expected." The table became very quiet. Not awkward, just understanding. Liza reached over and lightly touched my hand. "It gets easier." She didn't promise everything would be perfect. She didn't tell me I should stay, just, "It gets easier." Sometimes those 3 words are exactly what someone needs to hear. When the gathering finally ended, people slowly wandered toward the door. Nobody rushed away. Phone numbers were exchanged. Plans were made for next Thursday. Someone reminded everyone about a weekend community market. Someone else mentioned a charity book drive. Life simply continued. And somehow, I had quietly become part of it. That evening, I opened the yellow notebook again. This time, I didn't write a sentence. I wrote 1 word: belonging. I stared at it for a long time before closing the cover, because for the first time since my husband died, that word no longer felt impossible. The next week settled into a rhythm. Every morning, I'd walk the same streets, stop at the same coffee shop, smile at the same security guard standing outside the shopping center. By Wednesday, he greeted me before I greeted him. "Good morning, ma'am." Every single morning. It was such a small thing, yet somehow it made the city feel a little smaller. I started noticing things I had completely missed during my first few days. The woman who opened the little bakery before sunrise. The same gentleman reading his newspaper outside a cafe every morning. Students rushing to class with backpacks almost bigger than they were. Delivery riders waving to shop owners as they passed. Nothing extraordinary, just people living ordinary lives, and somehow I found comfort in that. Thursday came around again. This time I didn't stand outside the coffee morning wondering if I should go in. I walked through the door without stopping. Liza looked up. "There you are." Those 3 words made me smile all day. There you are. Someone had noticed I arrived. The conversations became easier. I learned everyone's names, although I occasionally mixed them up. Everyone laughed when I apologized. "So do we," one gentleman admitted. "We forget names all the time." That made me feel better. One morning, the conversation turned to food. Someone asked if I'd tried durian yet. The entire table became strangely quiet. Then everyone looked at me, almost as if they already knew the answer. I shook my head. Lisa smiled. "Oh, we have to fix that." Everyone laughed, including me. That Saturday, a few of us met at a weekend market. Fresh vegetables, local fruit, small family-owned food stalls, children running between tables, musicians playing nearby. I wasn't there because I needed groceries. I was there because someone had invited me. That realization caught me off guard. No one had invited me anywhere in a very long time. As we wandered through the market, Lisa introduced me to people she knew. A fruit vendor, a retired school principal, a couple who had recently opened a tiny flower stand. Every introduction was simple. "This is my friend Helen." My friend. Those words echoed in my mind. Not tourist, not visitor, friend. That afternoon, I returned to my hotel carrying a small paper bag. Inside were a few bananas, some locally roasted coffee, and a loaf of fresh bread that smelled so good I tore off a piece before I even reached the elevator. I laughed at myself, then realized I hadn't laughed that easily in years. Later that evening, I called my daughter. She answered on the second ring. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, sweetheart." We talked about ordinary things, the weather, her garden, the grandchildren. Then she asked, "So, how's the trip?" I looked down at the yellow notebook lying open beside me. For a moment, I wasn't sure how to answer. Finally, I smiled. "I don't think it feels like a trip anymore." There was silence. Then she quietly said, "You sound happy." After we hung up, I sat by the window for a long time. The city lights stretched across uptown. Cars moved steadily through the evening. People were still sitting outside restaurants talking over coffee. I opened my notebook. Under yesterday's entry, I wrote another. "I forgot to feel lonely today." I closed the notebook, held it against my chest for a moment, and quietly whispered, "Thank you." I wasn't entirely sure who I was thanking. Maybe life itself. A little over 2 weeks passed before I noticed something. It happened while I was making coffee one morning. I reached into my bag to check my return flight. Then I stopped. I couldn't remember the date. For the first week, I'd been counting every day. Now, I wasn't counting at all. That realization surprised me. I'd promised myself this was only a visit, a chance to see if I liked the Philippines, nothing more. But somewhere between morning walks, coffee with new friends, and quiet evenings watching the sun disappear over uptown, the city had stopped feeling unfamiliar. It had started feeling comfortable. One Thursday after coffee, Liza looked at me and smiled. "So, when do you fly home?" I opened my mouth to answer, then realized I didn't know. Not because I'd forgotten, because I hadn't wanted to think about it. That afternoon, I walked back to my hotel, slower than usual. For the first time, the thought of leaving made my chest feel heavy. I hadn't expected that. When I'd boarded the airplane, all I wanted was reassurance that I hadn't made a mistake. Now, I wasn't ready for the story to end. That evening, I called my daughter. We talked for nearly an hour. Near the end of the conversation, she asked, "So, are you looking forward to coming home?" I looked out the window before answering. "I don't know." It was the most honest answer I could give. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked something I'd been avoiding. "Mom, have you thought about staying a little longer?" I laughed. "I thought you wanted me home." "I do, but I also want you to be happy." The next morning, I opened the airline website, not to move my flight earlier, to see what it would cost to stay a little longer. My hands were shaking as I clicked the button. It wasn't because I was afraid of the money. It was because extending that ticket meant admitting something to myself. This place had become more than a destination. It had become part of my life. A few minutes later, the confirmation email arrived. My return flight was still there, just a little farther away. I smiled, closed the laptop, opened my yellow notebook, and wrote, "I'm not finished yet." About a week after extending my return flight, my phone rang. It was my daughter. She didn't waste time. "Mom, I've been thinking." I smiled. "That usually means something important." She laughed. "It does. I want to come see you." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. She quickly continued, "Not because I don't trust you. I need to see where you're living." I understood. If our roles had been reversed, I probably would have done the same thing. 3 weeks later, I found myself standing outside Laguindingan Airport. I was far more nervous than the day I'd arrived. When you're making life-changing decisions, it's one thing to explain them over the phone. It's another thing to have someone you love standing beside you, seeing everything with their own eyes. As soon as she walked through the arrival doors, she spotted me, then smiled. The kind of smile only daughters have, half excitement, half relief. She hugged me tighter than she had in years, then stepped back, looked at me for a moment, and frowned. "You look different." I laughed. "I hope that's a good thing." She studied my face for another second. "You look—" She stopped searching for the right word. "Peaceful." I hadn't expected that answer. Neither had she. On the drive toward Uptown, she asked questions almost the entire way. How was the hotel? Was I sleeping well? Had I gotten lost? Did I feel safe walking around? I answered each one honestly. Some days had been wonderful. Some had been difficult. There were still moments when I missed home terribly. I wanted her to understand that. This wasn't a perfect life. It was simply a life I was beginning to enjoy. The next morning, we walked to the coffee shop together. As soon as we opened the door, the young woman behind the counter smiled. "Good morning, Ma'am Helen." Then she noticed my daughter. "You have company today." My daughter looked at me, then back at the barista. "You know my mom?" The young woman laughed. "She comes in all the time." My daughter didn't say anything. She simply smiled. Later, while we were walking through Uptown, the security guard outside the shopping center waved. "Good morning, Ma'am Helen." I waved back, without thinking, the way I had every morning for weeks. My daughter quietly watched the exchange. She still didn't say anything. That afternoon, we stopped for lunch. Nothing fancy, just a small local restaurant. While we waited for our food, she finally looked at me and smiled. "I understand now." I tilted my head. "What do you mean?" She looked out the window for a moment, then back at me. "You've built a life." Not a vacation, not an escape, a life. Those 4 words stayed with me long after lunch, because until that moment, I don't think I'd realized it myself. Little by little, without planning to, I'd stopped being a visitor. I had simply become Helen. The morning my daughter flew home, we hugged outside the airport for a long time, longer than usual. Neither of us seemed in a hurry to let go. She looked at me, smiled, then said something I'll never forget. "I'm still going to miss you." She laughed a little, "but I don't think I'm worried anymore." I smiled. "I know." She hugged me one more time, picked up her carry-on, then disappeared into the terminal. I stood there for another minute, watching people arrive, watching others leave. A few months earlier, that airport had felt intimidating. Now it simply felt familiar. Funny how places change once they become part of your life. The drive back to Uptown was quiet, not lonely, just quiet. I rolled the window down, the warm air drifted through the car. For the first time, it smelled familiar. When I reached my room, I unpacked my small overnight bag, made myself a cup of coffee, then reached for the yellow notebook. The pages were beginning to curl at the corners. It had traveled thousands of miles with me, through airports, flights, long afternoons, moments of doubt, moments of hope. Without really thinking, I started turning the pages. Cagayan de Oro, the very first page. I smiled. The next one. Maybe. Then, I'm here. A few pages later, someone welcomed me today. I forgot to feel lonely. I'm not finished yet. Each sentence captured a version of me that no longer existed. I turned to the last blank page, held my pen above it, just like I had on my first afternoon here. Only this time, the words came easily. I wrote, I found home. Then I sat there for a while, looking at those 3 words, home. It wasn't a hotel room. It wasn't an apartment. It wasn't even a city. Home was waking up excited to see what the day might bring. Home was recognizing familiar faces, being greeted by name, having somewhere to walk every morning, someone to drink coffee with, something to look forward to. When my husband died, I honestly believed the most important chapter of my life had already been written. I wasn't searching for another country. I wasn't searching for adventure. I was searching for a reason to keep looking forward instead of backward. I just didn't know it yet. People sometimes ask me why I chose the Philippines. The truth is, I almost didn't. If a stranger in a Facebook group hadn't mentioned Cagayan de Oro, I might never have looked it up. If I'd listened only to fear, I would have stayed where everything was familiar. If I'd decided I was too old, none of this would have happened. Sometimes your whole future changes because you become curious enough to ask one question. I still miss my family. I always will. I still miss old friends. Certain holidays are harder than others. Some mornings, I wish I could sit at my old kitchen table one more time. Starting over doesn't erase the life you had before. It simply reminds you that your story doesn't have to end there. If there's one thing these past few months have taught me, it's this. Life doesn't stop when we retire. It doesn't stop when we lose someone we love. It doesn't stop because we're afraid. Sometimes it quietly waits for us to say yes. I came to the Philippines thinking I was looking for another place to live. I think I was looking for another chance to live. And somehow I found both. Thank you for spending a little time with me today. Wherever you are in life, I hope you never stop believing that another chapter is still possible.